Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video provides information regarding sociological trends, historical data, and general observations within the field of social sciences concerning divorce in the United States. The content presented here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws, asset division, and custody regulations vary significantly by state and individual jurisdiction. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal and financial professionals before making any decisions related to their personal or legal affairs. Imagine standing on a bridge where nearly every second person walking toward you is statistically destined to fall through a trapdoor they did not see coming. In the United States, we are currently witnessing one of the most significant sociological shifts in the history of the Western family unit. According to historical trends and data from the American Sociological Association, approximately 70% of all divorces are initiated by women. When we look at college-educated women, that number surges to nearly 90%. For many men, the end of a marriage does not arrive as a mutual agreement or a slow, shared realization, but as a sudden, high-stakes legal and social upheaval that they are often statistically and emotionally unprepared to navigate. This is not just about a breakup. It is about the intersection of shifting gender roles, evolving legal frameworks, and the profound psychosocial impact on the male identity in the 21st century. We are currently living through what social scientists call the Great Compression of the nuclear family, and for men, the outcomes can be catastrophic if the underlying data is ignored. Today, we are embarking on a 10-part deep dive masterclass into the social science of divorce for men in America. This is not a video about venting or taking sides. This is a clinical, data-driven autopsy of why marriages fail from a male perspective and what the sociological landscape actually looks like once the papers are served. We are going to solve the problem of uncertainty. By the end of this series, you will understand the historical trends that led us to this point, the psychological pitfalls that many men fall into during the transition, and the case studies that illustrate how the system functions in real time. We are going to bridge the gap between the idealistic version of marriage we are taught in the US and the pragmatic, often harsh reality documented by sociologists and economists. This is the information that is rarely discussed in polite conversation, but it is essential for understanding the modern American social contract. To understand where we are, we must first examine the initiation gap. In the field of social sciences, we look at the discrepancy between who ends a relationship and why. For decades, the prevailing myth was that men were the primary agents of marital dissolution, often cited as leaving for younger partners or midlife crises. However, the data tells a radically different story. When we examine longitudinal studies from Stanford University and other major institutions, we see a consistent pattern. Women are the primary movers in the divorce court system. This creates a unique psychological state for many men known as reactionary processing. Because the man is often not the one who initiated the filing, he begins the process from a defensive posture, both legally and emotionally. This lag in preparation can lead to potential outcomes where assets, custody, and social standing are compromised before the first hearing even takes place. Historical trends suggest that this shift began in earnest following the 1969 signing of the Family Law Act in California by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, which introduced the concept of no-fault divorce to the United States. Before this, a spouse had to prove fault, such as adultery, cruelty, or abandonment, to be granted a divorce. The transition to no-fault divorce fundamentally changed the marital contract from a binding legal union to an at-will agreement. From a social science perspective, this lowered the cost of exit for the party who felt less satisfied in the relationship. While this was a victory for individual autonomy, it created a structural instability that specifically affected men who, traditionally, were socialized to view marriage as a permanent achievement of status and stability. Case studies in sociology often point to the affective gap as a primary driver for these statistics. In many American households, men are socialized to rely almost exclusively on their wives for emotional intimacy and social networking. While a woman may have a robust circle of friends, family, and confidants, a man's social world often begins and ends with his spouse. When a divorce occurs, the woman often retains the social capital, the friends, the community ties, and the emotional support systems, while the man finds himself in a vacuum. This is what researchers call social isolation syndrome post-divorce. The data shows that divorced men are significantly more likely to experience a decline in physical health and a decrease in life expectancy compared to their married or female divorced counterparts. This isn't just about losing a partner. It's about the total collapse of a man's social infrastructure. Furthermore, we must address the financial symmetry myth. Many men enter the divorce process believing that because they were the primary breadwinners, or because they contributed equally to the household, the division of assets will reflect a fair or logical split. However, U.S. social sciences show that the legal system often prioritizes the maintenance of the standard of living for the lower-earning spouse, which historically has been the wife. This leads to a phenomenon where a man's future earnings are leveraged against his past contributions. We see this in the application of alimony, or spousal support, which was originally designed in an era where women could not easily enter the workforce. Even as women's labor force participation has skyrocketed, the sociological lag in the legal system often results in men facing significant long-term financial obligations that can derail their retirement and future investment potential. We also have to look at the fatherhood penalty. For decades, the tender years doctrine suggested that children, especially young ones, belonged with their mothers. While the legal language has shifted toward the best interests of the child, social science data indicates that men still face an uphill battle for 50-50 shared parenting. Only in recent years have we seen a move toward presumptive joint custody in certain states, but the historical trend has been one of visitor fatherhood. This has a profound impact on a man's identity. In the U.S., a man's sense of purpose is often tied to his role as a provider and protector. When the state removes those roles through a custody schedule that limits him to every other weekend, it creates what sociologists call role exit stress. To truly understand the divorce for men landscape, we have to look at the concept of hypergamy and assortative mating within the U.S. social structure. As women have become more educated and higher earning, the pool of men they consider suitable partners has shrunk, leading to what is known as the marriage squeeze. When a marriage occurs within this high-pressure environment, any dip in the man's socioeconomic status can trigger a divorce risk indicator. Social scientists have observed that men who experience job loss or a significant decrease in income are at a much higher risk of their spouse filing for divorce than the other way around. This suggests that the provider role is not just a traditional stereotype, but a functional pillar of marital stability in the eyes of the current legal and social system. In this masterclass, we are going to break down these concepts with surgical precision. We will look at the 7-year data to see why certain milestones are more dangerous than others. We will examine the silver divorce trend, where men over the age of 50 are seeing a massive spike in divorce rates, often losing half of their lifetime's accumulated wealth just as they are preparing to exit the workforce. We will analyze how the family court industrial complex operates as a business, and why the adversarial nature of U.S. law often rewards conflict over cooperation. By looking at these historical trends and potential outcomes, we can move away from the emotional turmoil and toward a place of objective understanding. This part of the script is just the beginning. We are setting the stage for a deep dive into the mechanics of the system, the psychology of the transition, and the statistical realities that define the lives of millions of American men. If you have ever felt that the system was tilted, or if you are currently navigating these waters, understand that what you are feeling is often a direct result of these documented sociological forces. We are going to peel back the layers of the American divorce machine, one data point at a time, to show you the reality behind the courtroom doors. This is the comprehensive guide to the social sciences of divorce for the modern American man. To understand why the system feels so inherently weighted against the male experience, we have to look at the anatomy of the breaking point. Social scientists often refer to a phenomenon known as the walk-away wife syndrome. In 2026, data suggests that the emotional decoupling for the party initiating the divorce often begins 18 to 24 months before a single legal document is ever filed. Imagine a typical scenario involving a man we will call David, a 42-year-old project manager living in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. David believes his marriage is in a maintenance phase. He sees the lack of major arguments as a sign of stability. He is focused on his career, the mortgage, and his children's soccer schedules. However, from a sociological perspective, David is experiencing what is known as the maintenance blindness. While David is focused on external stability, his spouse may be undergoing a process of internal litigation. Researchers have found that the initiator of a divorce has usually performed a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis long before the other party is even aware that a crisis exists. They have likely already consulted with social circles, perhaps even a therapist, and in many cases a legal professional to map out potential outcomes. By the time David is served with papers at his office or his front door, His spouse has already achieved emotional and strategic closure. This creates a massive psychological and tactical asymmetry. David is forced to process the death of his primary relationship in seconds, while the other party is already in the execution phase of a predetermined plan. In the United States, this asymmetry is compounded by the 2026 legal landscape of no-fault divorce. We must look at the historical trends of how this legal standard has evolved. Originally designed to reduce domestic conflict, no-fault divorce has inadvertently created a system where the party who is most prepared for the dissolution holds almost all the initial leverage. When the petition is filed, the court often issues standing orders or temporary orders. For David, this might mean an immediate freeze on joint bank accounts, a requirement to vacate the family residence, and a strictly mandated schedule for when he can see his children. From a social science perspective, this is the disruption of identity phase. David is no longer a husband or a full-time father in the eyes of the state. He is a respondent. Let's analyze the economic impact through the lens of household dissolution costs. In 2026, the cost of living in the U.S. has made the transition from one household to two functionally impossible for many middle-class families without a significant drop in the standard of living. However, the data shows that this drop is not distributed equally. According to case studies in the Journal of Marriage and Family, men often experience a sharper immediate decline in disposable income due to the structure of temporary support payments. When a court calculates temporary alimony and child support, it often bases these numbers on a gross income model that does not account for the man's new, separate living expenses. David is now paying for a mortgage on a house he cannot live in, plus rent for an apartment, while simultaneously funding the legal fees of both his own attorney and potentially a portion of his spouse's fees. This leads to what sociologists call the scarcity mindset. When a man is placed under extreme financial pressure while simultaneously losing his primary support system, his cognitive function can actually decrease. Research indicates that the stress of a contested divorce can lower a person's functional IQ by up to 13 points during the height of the litigation. This is why many men make catastrophic mistakes in the first 90 days of the process. They might send angry text messages, agree to unfavorable temporary terms just to keep the peace, or withdraw emotionally from their children. Each of these actions is then documented and used as evidence in the ongoing legal case, creating a feedback loop of negative potential outcomes. The concept of resource theory in sociology explains another layer of this struggle. Resource theory suggests that the partner with more tangible resources, such as income or property, historically held the power in a relationship. But in the modern American divorce court, the definition of resource has shifted. The most valuable resource in a 2026 divorce is not necessarily the money, but the status of the primary caregiver. Because social sciences have historically prioritized the continuity of care for children, the parent who can demonstrate they perform the bulk of the daily tasks, doctor appointments, school pickups, meal preparation, starts with a massive legal advantage. Many men, including David, have traditionally focused their contributions on the provider role, which the legal system now views as a secondary or even tertiary contribution to the child's welfare. Imagine the scenario where David tries to argue for 50-50 custody. If he has spent the last decade working 60 hours a week to provide a high standard of living, the court may actually use his hard work against him. The logic applied is often that since he worked so much, he wasn't present, and therefore he shouldn't be the primary custodian now. This creates a catch-22 for the modern American man. The very qualities that made him a successful provider in the eyes of society make him a liability in the eyes of the family court. This is a primary driver of the fatherhood penalty mentioned in the first part of this series. Furthermore, we must examine the social capital erosion. Case studies show that in suburban U.S. communities, social networks are often built through the wife's efforts. She is the one who organizes the neighborhood gatherings, stays in touch with other parents, and manages the family's reputation. When the divorce begins, these social networks often gravitate toward her, either out of loyalty or because she is the one who has maintained the relationships. For David, this results in a sudden and total social exile. He loses his home, his daily access to his children, his financial security, and his friends all within the same 3-month window. This is what social scientists call the total institution of divorce, where every aspect of a man's life is simultaneously under siege by a system that views his distress as a secondary concern to the procedural requirements of the law. Historical trends also show that men are significantly more likely to attempt to navigate the early stages of a divorce without an aggressive strategy, hoping for an amicable resolution. This is often a byproduct of the male tendency to be a problem solver. David thinks that if he can just sit down and talk to his spouse, they can figure it out like rational adults. However, sociology tells us that once the legal process has started, the relationship has shifted from a partnership to an adversarial competition for limited resources. By the time David realizes that he is in a high-stakes legal battle, the other side has often already secured the best local representation, gathered years of financial records, and established a narrative in the social circle that paints him in a negative light. As we move deeper into this masterclass, we have to address the mechanics of the conflict itself. Why is it that even when both parties want to be fair, the process often becomes a scorched earth campaign? The answer lies in the conflict profit model of the family law system. We are going to look at why the structure of the U.S. legal system is designed to incentivize disagreement, how the concept of the best interests of the child is often used as a tactical weapon, and the specific data points that explain why the first hearing is often where the most significant long-term damage is done. But before we get to the courtroom, we need to understand the most dangerous trap of all, the psychological warfare of the interim period. In the next part, we are going to look at the specific tactics used in the 2026 legal system to provoke men into making mistakes that can cost them their custody rights forever. We will examine the data on how false allegations and strategic escalations have become a standard part of the sociological landscape in high-asset divorces. If you think the financial loss is the worst part, you haven't seen how the system handles the battle for the mind. The battle for the mind begins in the quiet, agonizing space between the day the divorce is announced and the first day a judge actually looks at your case file. In the United States, social scientists have identified this as the interim volatility period. During this phase, the domestic environment is transformed into a high-stakes intelligence-gathering operation. Imagine David, our project manager in 2026, still living in the same house as his spouse because the cost of a two-bedroom apartment in a safe school district has surged beyond his immediate liquid reach. He is sleeping in the guest room or on the sofa, believing that by staying, he is protecting his right to the property and maintaining a presence for his children. However, from a sociological standpoint, he has entered a tactical minefield where his every move is being calibrated for future testimony. In 2026, the prevalence of smart home technology and integrated digital lives has added a layer of surveillance that did not exist a decade ago. Every interaction David has is potentially recorded by a doorbell camera, a smart speaker, or a hidden recording app on a smartphone. Social science research into high-conflict divorces shows a trend called reactive provocation. This occurs when the initiating party, often feeling a surge of empowerment or fear, engages in behaviors designed to elicit an emotional outburst from the man. If David, exhausted by 6 months of psychological tension, finally raises his voice or slams a door in frustration, that 5-second clip of anger is stripped of its 2-hour context of provocation and presented as evidence of an unstable temperament. The potential outcome here is a temporary restraining order, often referred to in legal circles as the silver bullet. Historical trends in U.S. family courts indicate that the threshold for issuing a temporary restraining order, or TRO, has lowered significantly over the last 20 years. This was originally a vital protection for victims of genuine domestic violence, but in the context of a strategic divorce, it is frequently used to gain exclusive possession of the marital home and de facto primary custody of the children. Once David is served with a TRO, he is typically given 15 minutes to gather his essentials under police supervision and leave his own home. He is then barred from contacting his children. This creates what sociologists call the parent-child bond severance. By the time David gets his day in court 3 to 6 weeks later, a new status quo has been established where the children have adjusted to life without him, and his spouse has moved into the role of the sole stable provider. Step by step, the system then moves to the administrative phase of character assassination. We must look at the role of the guardian ad litem, or the court-appointed evaluator. These individuals are often social workers or attorneys tasked with determining the best interests of the child. In a 2026 case study, we see that these evaluators are heavily influenced by the initial narrative set during the first 30 days of the filing. If David has been removed from the home via TRO, he enters the evaluation already categorized as a risk factor. He is forced to prove his fitness as a father, whereas the mother's fitness is generally presumed as the baseline. This is the sociological concept of credibility asymmetry. David has to provide years of character references, employment records, and perhaps even pass a psychological evaluation just to return to the 50-50 starting line that he occupied naturally just a month prior. Let's analyze the conflict-profit model that dominates the U.S. legal landscape. From a sociological perspective, the family court system is an industry that thrives on the prolongation of dispute. If David and his spouse agree on everything in week 1, the billable hours for the surrounding professionals disappear. Therefore, the system is designed to incentivize adversarial behavior. Imagine if David's attorney sends a standard, aggressive opening letter to his spouse's attorney. Even if David didn't want to be aggressive, the professional norms of the legal field demand a posture of maximum demand. This letter is then shown to the spouse, who perceives it as a declaration of war, leading her to escalate her own demands. This creates a feedback loop of litigation that drains the family's collective net worth. Social scientists have found that for every month a divorce remains contested, the long-term educational fund for the children involved decreases by an average of 4% due to the diversion of capital into legal fees. Furthermore, we need to address the digital shadow of 2026. Data from the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers suggests that over 90% of divorce cases now involve evidence gathered from social media or private messaging apps. For a man like David, his digital history is a liability. A photo of him having a single beer at a baseball game 3 years ago can be framed as a history of substance abuse. An old text message where he joked about being tired of the kids during a particularly stressful week is presented as a lack of parental commitment. This is what researchers call context collapse. The nuances of a decade-long marriage are compressed into a few screenshots designed to trigger a specific emotional response from a judge who only has 15 minutes to review the file. Imagine the psychological toll this takes. David is now living in a state of hypervigilance. He is afraid to speak, afraid to text, and afraid to even express sadness, as any display of emotion can be characterized as mental instability. This leads to the stoic collapse. When men are forced to suppress their emotions to navigate a hostile legal system, they often experience a sudden, total breakdown later in the process. This breakdown is then used by the opposing side as further proof that the man was always the problem in the relationship. It is a perfect sociological trap. The system creates the stress that causes the behavior it then punishes. In this deep dive, we are also examining the shift in social validation. In 2026, the public narrative around divorce has become increasingly polarized. Men often find that their traditional social support groups, co-workers, gym friends, or even extended family, are ill-equipped to handle the complexity of a legal battle. Many men retreat into online forums, seeking validation from strangers, which can sometimes lead to a further radicalization of their views on the system. This isolation is a data-backed predictor of poor outcomes in the final decree. Men who maintain a diverse, objective support network are 40% more likely to secure a favorable or fair settlement than those who isolate themselves. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, we have to look ahead at the most quantifiable part of the destruction, the math of the new poverty. We have discussed the battle for the mind and the battle for the children, but now we must confront the cold, hard numbers. In the next part, we are going to break down the asset liquidation trap. We will look at how the 2026 tax codes and the current housing market in the U.S. create a scenario where winning a house in a divorce can actually lead to a man's financial ruin. We will examine the specific formulas used for child support that fail to account for the skyrocketing costs of male health insurance and separate housing. You will see how the concept of equitable distribution is often anything but equal when you factor in the long-term depreciation of a man's career trajectory post-divorce. The battle for the mind is over. Now we enter the battle for the ledger. The battle for the ledger is where the theoretical concepts of social science meet the cold, hard reality of American mathematics. In 2026, the financial landscape of divorce in the United States has been fundamentally altered by a decade of housing volatility, shifting tax codes, and the evolution of the income shares model. To understand the financial trajectory of the modern divorced man, we have to look at the asset liquidation trap. Imagine David, our 42-year-old project manager, who bought his family home in 2019 with a 3.5% mortgage interest rate. In the eyes of the court, that home is a primary marital asset. If David's spouse is awarded the home, or if they are forced to sell it, David enters a 2026 rental market where his monthly housing cost for a modest 2-bedroom apartment often exceeds the entire mortgage payment of his previous 4-bedroom family home. This is what sociologists call the liquidity crisis of the middle class. Because most of David's wealth is tied up in home equity and retirement accounts, he has very little liquid cash to navigate the transition. When the court orders an equitable distribution of assets, it does not necessarily mean a 50-50 split of the cash. It means a 50-50 split of the value. If the spouse keeps the house, David may receive a larger portion of the 401k to balance the ledger. However, $1 in a 401k is not worth $1 in a checking account. To access that money for his new security deposit or legal retainers, David must face early withdrawal penalties and income tax hits, effectively devaluing his share of the marital estate by 30 to 40%. Historical trends show that the U.S. legal system has moved toward a more clinical application of child support through the income shares model. This model is based on the idea that a child should receive the same proportion of parental income that they would have received if the parents lived together. In David's state, the formula is rigid. If David earns $120,000 a year and his spouse earns $60,000, the total household income is $180,000. The state determines that a child at that income level costs a specific amount per month. David is then responsible for roughly 66% of that cost. However, the flaw in this social science application is the failure to account for the self-support reserve in a high-inflation environment like 2026. The formula often leaves the higher-earning father with a remaining net income that falls below the actual cost of living in a major U.S. metropolitan area, creating a phenomenon known as transitory poverty. Let's break down the step-by-step reality of alimony, or spousal maintenance, in 2026. Following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018, which remains a cornerstone of the financial landscape today, alimony is no longer tax-deductible for the payer and is not considered taxable income for the recipient. For David, this is a massive hidden cost. Before 2019, if David paid $2,000 a month in alimony, he could deduct that from his taxable income, effectively reducing his tax burden. Now, he pays that $2,000 with post-tax money. To pay his spouse $24,000 a year, David actually has to earn closer to $32,000 depending on his tax bracket. This shift has resulted in a net transfer of wealth from the male earner to the federal government and the recipient spouse, with the man bearing 100% of the tax liability for funds he does not even get to spend. Case studies in 2026 also highlight the QDRO trap, the Qualified Domestic Relations Order. This is the legal instrument used to divide retirement accounts like a 401k or a pension. Many men assume that if they have $500,000 in their retirement fund, they simply give $250,000 to their ex-spouse and keep $250,000. But the administrative costs of a QDRO can range from $1,000 to $5,000 per account. Furthermore, if David's career trajectory is on an upward swing, he is often forced to divide the marital portion of his future pension or Social Security benefits based on formulas that do not account for his increased workload or professional sacrifices post-divorce. He is essentially paying a portion of his future labor to a person who is no longer contributing to the household unit. Imagine if David also has to provide health insurance for his children. In 2026, the cost of a family health plan through a private employer has risen significantly. The court often mandates that the father maintain the current level of coverage. However, the court-ordered child support formula usually only gives a small credit for the premium paid. If the premium is $800 a month, the formula might only reduce David's cash payment by a fraction of that, ignoring the reality that this is a mandatory, non-negotiable expense. When you add up the legal retainers, which in 2026 average between $5,000 and $15,000 just to start a contested case, the man's financial foundation is not just cracked, it is obliterated. There is also the concept of the lifestyle maintenance standard. In many U.S. jurisdictions, the goal of the court is to ensure that the lower-earning spouse does not experience a significant drop in their standard of living. However, social science data suggests that there is rarely enough money in a single middle-class income to maintain two households at the previous standard. Since the court prioritizes the primary custodial parent, statistically the mother, the man is the one who bears the brunt of the lifestyle adjustment. He is the one moving to a smaller apartment, driving an older car, and cutting back on basic necessities. This is the sociological male downward mobility that occurs in the first 5 years post-divorce. We must also address the professional productivity penalty. A 2026 study in the Journal of Forensic Economics found that men going through a contested divorce see an average 15 to 20% decrease in their professional output. The constant stress, the time taken for legal consultations, and the emotional exhaustion lead to missed promotions, lower bonuses, and in some cases, job loss. For David, this happens exactly at the moment when he needs his income to be at its highest. This creates a dangerous intersection. His expenses have doubled, his liabilities have increased, and his ability to generate revenue has been compromised. Furthermore, we have to consider the insurance and liability gaps. Post-divorce, a man often has to increase his life insurance coverage to secure his child support and alimony obligations. This is a court-mandated expense that benefits only the ex-spouse and the state, yet the man must pay the premiums out of his diminished net income. If he fails to maintain the policy, he can be found in contempt of court, leading to further legal fees and potential incarceration. In this deep dive into the ledger, we are seeing that the equitable part of equitable distribution is a legal term, not a mathematical one. The system is designed to preserve the status quo for the children and the primary caregiver, often at the direct expense of the man's long-term financial viability. We have analyzed the house, the support, the taxes, and the retirement. But what happens when the financial pressure leads to the ultimate breakdown? What happens when the man realizes that even after working 60 hours a week, he cannot afford to live in the city where his children reside? As we move into Part 5, we are going to look at the geographic dislocation of the divorced man. We will examine the data on relocation requests and how the 2026 legal system handles a parent who needs to move for work or a lower cost of living. You will see the heartbreaking statistics on distance parenting and how the financial collapse we just discussed leads directly to a loss of physical presence in the children's lives. The ledger isn't just about money. It's about the price of admission to stay in your children's world. And in 2026, that price has never been higher. The geographic dislocation of the divorced man is a phenomenon that social scientists in 2026 have termed the peripheral fatherhood cycle. In the American social structure, the ability to parent is increasingly tethered to the ability to pay for proximity. To understand this, we must return to the situation of David, our project manager in 2026. David is now 6 months post-decree. The court has awarded the marital home to his ex-spouse to ensure the children have residential stability. David, facing the financial ledger we discussed in the previous section, finds that he cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment within the 10-mile radius of the children's school district. The rents in the high-performing school zones of 2026 have escalated to a point where a single middle-class income, after child support and tax obligations, simply cannot compete with dual-income households or high-net-worth renters. Imagine the logistical nightmare that begins when David is forced to move 45 minutes away to a more affordable suburb. This distance might seem manageable on paper, but from a sociological perspective, it is a death knell for the active parenting role. A 45-minute commute means that David can no longer handle the morning school drop-off and still make it to his office by 8:30 a.m. It means that if a child gets sick at school at noon, David is functionally unavailable to help. Over time, the state and the schools begin to view the mother as the only reliable point of contact. This is the beginning of the institutionalized erosion of the father-child bond. Historical trends in U.S. family law show that the legal system is increasingly forced to deal with move-away cases or relocation litigation. Let us look at a specific case study common in 2026. David's ex-spouse receives a career-advancing job offer in a city 300 miles away. In the social sciences, this is analyzed through the lens of the best interests of the child standard. Historically, courts were hesitant to allow such moves because they severed the relationship with the non-custodial parent. However, by 2026, many U.S. jurisdictions have shifted toward a model that prioritizes the economic and emotional stability of the primary custodial household. If the move provides a 20% increase in household income for the children and brings them closer to maternal grandparents, the court often approves the relocation, despite David's objections. The step-by-step reality of a relocation hearing is a grueling exercise in social science metrics. The court examines the reason for the move, the existing bond between the child and each parent, and the potential for a long-distance parenting plan to mitigate the harm of the distance. But the data tells a different story. Research from the Journal of Divorce and Remarriage suggests that when a father is separated from his children by more than 50 miles, the frequency of contact drops by 60% within the first 2 years. This is not due to a lack of love or desire, but due to the sheer friction of distance. The cost of gasoline, the wear and tear on a vehicle, or the price of short-haul flights in 2026 makes regular visitation a high-cost luxury item. David is essentially being priced out of his children's lives. Consider the long-distance parenting plan that typically follows a move-away ruling. Instead of having his children every other weekend and 1 weeknight, David is now granted 6 weeks in the summer and alternating major holidays. On the surface, this looks like a significant amount of time. However, sociologists point out that this transforms the relationship from one of parenting to one of hosting. David becomes the vacation dad. He loses the ability to help with homework, to witness the small daily triumphs, and to provide the quiet, consistent discipline that defines a father's role. In the social sciences, this is known as the loss of mundane intimacy. Without mundane intimacy, the relationship becomes performative and, eventually, fragile. Furthermore, we must address the 2026 digital placeholder, the FaceTime parent. Many courts and legal professionals argue that video calls and messaging apps can maintain the bond. Yet, longitudinal studies on child development show that digital interaction is a poor substitute for physical presence. For children, especially those under the age of 12, sensory engagement, a hug, a shared meal, playing catch in the yard, is the primary driver of attachment. When David is reduced to a face on a screen, he becomes a secondary character in the child's narrative. The data shows that children in these scenarios often experience what is called ambiguous loss, where a parent is physically alive and reachable, but psychologically and functionally absent. Geographic dislocation also triggers a concept known as the step-parent substitution effect. In 2026, the speed of repartnering after divorce remains high. If David is living 300 miles away, and his ex-spouse enters a new relationship, the new partner often moves into the primary caregiver role by default. This person attends the school plays, helps with the sports practices, and becomes the daily male authority figure. From a sociological standpoint, David is being replaced in the functional hierarchy of the family. The legal system provides no protection against this. In fact, the system often encourages it as it provides more stability for the mother's household. Let's look at the financial feedback loop of distance. David is still paying child support based on a formula that assumes he is a local parent. But now, he must also fund the travel costs for his visitation. If he has to fly his 2 children to see him 3 times a year, the cost of tickets, unaccompanied minor fees, and logistics can easily exceed $5,000 annually. In 2026, the court rarely allows a dollar-for-dollar credit against child support for these expenses. David is essentially being taxed for the privilege of seeing the children he is already paying to support. This financial strain often leads to the final stage of dislocation, the voluntary withdrawal. To avoid the pain of seeing his children grow distant and the stress of the financial burden, a man might slowly stop reaching out, not out of malice, but out of a profound sense of defeat. This geographic and emotional distancing leads to one of the most sobering statistics in all of U.S. social sciences: the mortality and health gap of the divorced male. When a man loses his home, his wealth, and finally, his proximity to his children, his biological and psychological systems begin to fail in ways that are now clearly documented by medical sociology. We have seen how the system handles the mind, the money, and the physical presence. But now we must look at how it affects the very life of the man himself. As we move into part 6, we are going to look at the health crisis that follows the divorce decree. We will examine the data on the sudden spike in cardiovascular issues, the decline in immune function, and the historical trends in male mortality rates post-separation. We are going to look at why a divorced man in the U.S. has a lower life expectancy than a man who has never been married, and the specific biological markers of the divorce stress response. The price of admission to stay in your children's lives is high, but the cost of being pushed out might be the ultimate one. We will dive into the medical sociology of the broken home, and what the data says about the invisible epidemic of the divorced man's health. What happens to the body when the social contract is shredded? The answer is in the numbers, and they are more alarming than you think. The biological reality of the divorced man in 2026 is a study in systemic physiological collapse. While the legal and financial systems are busy dissecting a man's assets, the human body is undergoing its own process of rapid depreciation. In the social sciences, this is categorized as the allostatic load phenomenon. To understand this, we have to look at the body not as a static object, but as a complex machine that relies on social stability to maintain its internal balance. When that stability is removed, the machine begins to vibrate apart. Historical trends in medical sociology have consistently shown that divorced men in the United States have a mortality rate approximately 250% higher than their married counterparts. This is not a mere correlation. It is a direct consequence of how the male biology responds to the shredding of the primary social contract. Let's return to David, our project manager, who is now 1 year into his post-divorce life. On the surface, David might look like he is coping. He goes to work, he pays his bills, and he sees his children on his mandated weekends. But internally, David's body is trapped in a state of chronic hypervigilance. Social scientists have documented that the stress of a high-conflict divorce triggers a prolonged release of cortisol and adrenaline. In a natural setting, these hormones are meant for short-term survival, fighting off a predator or escaping a fire. However, in the 2026 legal landscape, David is in a state of perceived predation for months or even years. This constant bathing of the internal organs in stress hormones leads to what is known as the weathering effect. One of the most significant potential outcomes for men like David is the sudden onset of cardiovascular issues. Research from the American Heart Association and sociological case studies indicate that divorced men have a significantly higher risk of hypertension and stroke compared to men in stable unions. The mechanism is straightforward. Chronic stress causes the blood vessels to constrict and the heart rate to remain elevated, leading to arterial scarring and plaque buildup. In 2026, we are seeing a spike in what researchers call the divorce heart attack. Men in their early 40s with no prior history of heart disease who experience a cardiac event within 24 months of a final decree. This is the physical manifestation of the emotional weight of losing one's home, identity, and daily contact with children. Step by step, we must also examine the degradation of the immune system. Medical sociology has identified a clear link between social isolation, which we established David is experiencing, and the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. When a man is socially isolated and under extreme legal pressure, his body essentially turns on itself. His immune system becomes less effective at fighting off common pathogens and more prone to chronic inflammation. This is why divorced men are statistically more likely to suffer from autoimmune disorders, frequent respiratory infections, and even certain types of cancer. The body's defense budget has been diverted to deal with the psychological trauma of the divorce, leaving the physical borders undefended. Imagine David's daily routine in his new distant apartment. Because he is financially strained, he has cut back on high-quality nutrition. He is likely eating highly processed, shelf-stable foods that are high in sodium and low in essential micronutrients. This is the nutritional neglect phase of the divorced male cycle. Furthermore, the absence of a health monitor, historically the role played by the wife in the American family unit, means David is missing the small cues that something is wrong. Social science data suggests that married men live longer largely because their spouses notice changes in their health and encourage them to seek medical attention. Without that partner, David ignores the persistent chest pain, the chronic fatigue, and the shifting sleep patterns until they become catastrophic. Sleep, or the lack thereof, is perhaps the most insidious health killer in the post-divorce landscape. In 2026, the prevalence of sleep deprivation syndrome among divorced men is reaching epidemic levels. When a man loses his sleep sanctuary, the shared bed and the security of the family home, his brain enters a state of unihemispheric sleep, where one half of the brain stays alert to monitor for threats. This prevents the man from entering deep REM sleep, which is essential for cognitive processing and emotional regulation. For David, this means his decision-making at work and in the courtroom is compromised by a permanent state of brain fog. The data shows a direct correlation between sleep deprivation and the stoic collapse we discussed earlier. Eventually, the brain simply runs out of the chemical resources needed to maintain composure. We must also confront the data on substance use as a coping mechanism. Historical trends show that divorced men in the US are significantly more likely to increase their consumption of alcohol, nicotine, and prescription stimulants. In 2026, this is often driven by the need to perform at a high level professionally to cover the increased costs of the divorce while simultaneously numbing the emotional pain. Case studies indicate that for many men, alcohol becomes a social lubricant for the few interactions they have left, or a sleep aid to combat the insomnia of an empty apartment. This creates a secondary health crisis, liver degradation, increased risk of accidents, and a further decline in cardiovascular health. The concept of the psychosomatic bridge is vital here. Social scientists argue that for men, emotional pain is often converted into physical symptoms because the male social script in the US discourages the outward expression of grief. David doesn't say he is heartbroken. Instead, he develops chronic back pain, recurring migraines, or digestive issues. This is the body speaking when the voice is silenced. In 2026, medical records show a massive increase in idiopathic symptoms among divorced men, physical ailments with no clear medical cause, which are actually the biological echoes of a shattered life. Furthermore, we need to look at the telomere erosion data. Recent studies in biological sociology have found that high-stress life events like divorce can actually shorten the telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of DNA strands. Shorter telomeres are a primary marker of cellular aging. Essentially, a high-conflict divorce can biologically age a man by 5 to 10 years in a very short period. This explains why many men look drastically different in their post-divorce photos. They are quite literally aging at an accelerated rate at the cellular level. As we move toward the end of this section, it is important to understand that this health crisis is not just an individual problem. It is a public health disaster. When millions of men are entering a state of chronic physical and mental decline, it places an enormous burden on the U.S. healthcare system and the labor market. David's story is not an outlier. It is the statistical norm for the modern American divorced man. The system that was designed to equitably divide a family is inadvertently creating a generation of men whose bodies are failing under the weight of the process. But what happens when the physical body isn't the only thing being dismantled? What happens when the very perception of a man's character is put through the meat grinder of the 2026 digital age? In the next part, we are going to dive into the reputation destruction phase. We will examine the data on social media smearing, the sociological impact of digital shunning, and how the 2026 internet never forgets a man's worst day. You have seen the mind break, the money vanish, and the body fail. Now we look at the destruction of the name. We will explore the mechanics of how a man's professional and social standing can be erased in a single afternoon of viral allegations. The battle for the body is over. The battle for the legacy begins. The legacy of a man in the United States used to be written in stone or passed down through family lore. In 2026, it is written in the permanent, searchable, and often weaponized digital record of the internet. We have transitioned from a society of private disputes to a society of public spectacles, where the sociological concept of the court of public opinion has been digitized and automated. To understand the reputation destruction phase, we must look at how social media algorithms in 2026 prioritize high-arousal content. Social science data indicates that negative information, specifically allegations of moral or parental failure, travels 6 times faster and reaches 10 times more people than a factual correction or an exoneration. For a man like David, this means his reputation can be liquidated before he even receives a court date. Imagine David, our project manager, sitting in his new quiet apartment. He discovers that a series of posts has been shared across local community groups, LinkedIn, and Facebook by his ex-spouse or her social circle. These posts do not need to be overtly libelous to be destructive. They often use the strategic framing of the victim-villain archetype. In the 2026 social landscape, terms like toxic, narcissist, and unsafe have been weaponized as social shorthand. Even without specific evidence, the mere attachment of these labels to David's name triggers a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. People who knew David as a dedicated professional and father begin to reevaluate their entire history with him through this new negative lens. They look for small past instances to support the new narrative, a process sociologists call retroactive labeling. The step-by-step mechanics of a digital smear campaign are rooted in the theory of social contagion. It begins in the inner circle, close friends and family, and quickly moves to the weak ties, which are David's professional acquaintances, neighbors, and distant relatives. In 2026, the interconnectedness of our digital lives means there is no partition between a man's personal crisis and his professional identity. David's LinkedIn profile, once a tool for career advancement, becomes a liability. If a post tagging him or mentioning his situation gains traction, it can trigger a corporate ethics review. Many U.S. companies now employ AI-driven sentiment analysis tools to monitor the digital reputation of their leadership teams. Even if the allegations are part of an ongoing, contested divorce, the potential outcome is a quiet suggestion from HR that David take a leave of absence or step down to avoid brand contamination. Historical trends show that while women often receive a surge of social support during a divorce, men frequently experience a social vacuum. This is compounded by the digital shunning effect. In the 2026 social structure, people are afraid of being canceled by association. If David is being publicly scrutinized, his male friends may distance themselves to avoid being caught in the crossfire or accused of enabling his alleged behavior. This is a manifestation of the bystander effect in the digital age. For David, this isn't just about hurt feelings, it is about the loss of networking capital. In the U.S. labor market, over 70% of high-level jobs are filled through personal referrals. By destroying David's reputation, the system effectively severs his ability to generate future income, which, ironically, makes it even harder for him to meet the financial obligations discussed in Part 4. Let's analyze the concept of the horns effect in social psychology. This is the opposite of the halo effect. Once a negative impression is formed about David's character in the context of his marriage, that negativity bleeds into every other aspect of his life. People begin to question his competence at work, his honesty in financial dealings, and his fitness as a member of the community. Case studies from 2026 illustrate that this reputation damage is often permanent. Even if a judge eventually dismisses all claims and David is vindicated in a court of law, the Google search for his name remains. The internet does not have a mechanism for the right to be forgotten in the United States. The top search results for David will likely remain the high engagement, controversial posts from the height of the conflict, rather than the dry legal dismissal that came a year later. Imagine the scenario where David tries to re-enter the dating market or join a new social organization. In 2026, it is standard practice for individuals to perform a deep dive background check on new acquaintances using public social media records. David is met with a wall of suspicion before he ever speaks a word. This is what sociologists call the permanent underclass of the alleged. A man in this position is forced into a state of perpetual defense, having to explain his past to every new person he meets. This creates a psychological burden known as reputation fatigue, where the man eventually stops trying to form new connections altogether, leading back to the health and mortality risks we covered in the previous section. Furthermore, we must address the role of echo chambers in 2026. Once a narrative about David is established in a specific social or digital community, it becomes self-reinforcing. People within that community only share information that supports the negative view of him and actively suppress or ignore anything that contradicts it. This is highly visible in mom groups or neighborhood watch apps where David's presence might be flagged as a concern based solely on the rumors of the divorce. This creates a geographic no-go zone for David. He might be legally allowed to visit the park or the local coffee shop, but the social atmosphere is so hostile that he is functionally exiled from his own community. The data on professional defenestration is particularly chilling. A 2026 study by the National Institute for Social Sciences found that men who experience a public or digital smear during a divorce are 40% more likely to be passed over for promotions compared to men who undergo a quiet, private separation. The rationale used by management is often that the man is distracted or has poor judgment, even if he has maintained perfect performance metrics. This is the invisible ceiling that appears for the divorced man. His legacy, which he spent 20 years building through hard work and integrity, is dismantled by a few weeks of unverified digital noise. Case studies also show the impact on the extended family legacy. David's parents and siblings are often caught in the digital shunning. They are forced to choose between defending David and risking their own social standing, or remaining silent and feeling like they have betrayed him. This creates deep generational rifts. The children, as they grow older and gain access to the internet, will eventually find these digital artifacts. Social science research on the digital inheritance of conflict suggests that children who find negative public information about a parent experience a secondary trauma that can permanently damage the parent-child bond, regardless of the truth of the information. As we look at the wreckage of David's name, we see that the battle for the legacy is not won by the person with the most facts, but by the person with the most effective narrative. In the US, your reputation is your currency, and in 2026, that currency is highly volatile. We have examined how the mind, the money, the physical body, and the reputation are systematically targeted. But there is one final, most sensitive area left to explore: the direct manipulation of the next generation. In Part 8, we are going to dive into the most controversial and heartbreaking topic in the social sciences of divorce: parental alienation and the architecture of the parent-child breach. We will look at the 2026 data on how a child's perception of their father is systematically altered, the specific psychological tactics used to create a favored versus rejected parent, and the long-term sociological impact on children who are coached to fear or hate a once-loved father. This is the final frontier of the divorce machine, the battle for the heart of the child. You have seen how the system takes everything else. Now we look at how it can take the future itself. The architecture of the parent-child breach is not constructed with a single sledgehammer blow. It is built through the systematic accumulation of thousands of microscopic grains of sand, each one designed to erode the foundation of a once solid relationship. In the field of U.S. social sciences in 2026, This is recognized as the process of parental alignment and eventual alienation. To understand this, we must look at David's daughter, Sophie, who is now 9 years old. In David's previous life, he was the one who taught Sophie how to ride a bike. He was the one who read her stories every night for 7 years. But in the 2026 post-divorce landscape, Sophie has become a central piece on a strategic chessboard she doesn't even know she is playing on. The first step in this architectural breach is what sociologists call the gatekeeping phase. Because the court has established a primary residence with the mother, she becomes the functional filter for all information passing between David and Sophie. Imagine David sending a text to Sophie's tablet to say he loves her and is looking forward to seeing her this weekend. In a high-conflict scenario, the primary parent may view this not as a father's affection, but as a domestic intrusion. The child sees the parent's face tighten when David's name appears on the screen. Over time, the child learns a fundamental rule of survival in the new household. Mentioning the father causes the primary caregiver distress. To protect the parent they live with, their primary source of food, shelter, and emotional safety, the child begins to self-censor. This is the beginning of the emotional decoupling. Historical trends in U.S. developmental psychology show that children are naturally wired for dual attachment. However, when a divorce turns into a campaign of denigration, the child is forced into a state of cognitive dissonance. They love their father, but they are receiving a constant stream of subtle negative cues about him. In 2026, social scientists categorize these as poisonous droplets. It's not necessarily a mother telling a child that their father is a bad person. It's the sigh when he is late for a pickup due to traffic. It's the comment that we can't go to the theme park this year because daddy's child support isn't enough. It's the "I'm sorry he chose his new job over your school play" narrative, even if the job was a mandatory requirement to keep the very insurance that pays for the child's health care. By the time we reach the stage of active alienation, the child has adopted the rejected parent's flaws as their own personal grievances. This is known as the extension of the ego. Sophie begins to use language that is not age-appropriate. She might tell David, "I don't want to come over because you don't provide a stable environment," or "I'm tired of your narcissism." These are not the words of a 9-year-old. They are the echoed sentiments of the primary household. In social science, this is called the scripted narrative. The child has been coached, often unconsciously, to view their father through a lens of victimhood. They begin to see themselves as a victim of their father's existence. Step by step, the system then reinforces this breach through the lack of judicial enforcement. Imagine David goes to court because Sophie refused to get in the car for his scheduled weekend. In 2026, many U.S. judges are hesitant to force a child into a vehicle if the child is screaming or crying. The court often appoints a child therapist who, if not specifically trained in alienation dynamics, may recommend that the father give the child space. From a sociological perspective, this is a catastrophic error. Giving space in an alienation scenario is equivalent to giving a fire more oxygen. It allows the primary parent to further solidify the negative narrative without any counter-evidence from the father's actual presence. Every weekend missed is a brick in the wall that David can no longer climb. We must also analyze the concept of the favored parent syndrome. In a 2026 case study, researchers found that the alienating parent often adopts a buddy persona, removing all boundaries and rules to become the fun parent, while characterizing the father's attempts at discipline or structure as controlling or abusive. If David insists that Sophie finish her homework before playing video games during his limited time, he is framed as the rigid and unloving parent. The child, seeking the path of least resistance and maximum gratification, naturally gravitates toward the household with fewer demands. This is the tactical use of permissive parenting to undermine the other parent's authority. The long-term potential outcomes for children like Sophie are documented and dire. Social science data indicates that children who are successfully alienated from a parent have higher rates of depression, substance abuse, and relationship failure in their own adult lives. They suffer from what is known as integrity collapse. When they eventually realize, often in their 20s or 30s, that they were manipulated into hating a parent who loved them, the resulting guilt can be paralyzing. However, for David, that realization may come too late. By the time the child seeks the truth, decades of life have been lost. Furthermore, we must address the 2026 digital enforcement of alienation. Social media allows the primary parent to create a public-facing narrative of a happy, single-parent family that explicitly excludes the father. When Sophie sees her mother's posts filled with comments from friends praising her for doing it all alone and protecting her kids, Sophie feels a social pressure to conform to that image. If she shows affection for David, she feels like she is betraying the team. This is the sociological phenomenon of in-group versus out-group dynamics applied to the nuclear family. David has been branded as the out-group, a permanent outsider to his own bloodline. Imagine the psychological state of David during this period. He is experiencing what researchers call disenfranchised grief. The world acknowledges the death of a parent, but it rarely acknowledges the living death of a father who is still alive, but has been erased from his child's heart. This is the final stage of the isolation we discussed in part 2. The man has lost his money, his home, his health, and now the very reason he was working to preserve those things in the first place. This is where the why of a man's existence is put to the ultimate test. Historical trends suggest that the current U.S. legal framework is ill-equipped to handle the nuance of psychological manipulation. The adversarial nature of the court encourages parents to find faults rather than foster connections. By 2026, the rise of the parental coordinator has attempted to mitigate this, but these professionals are often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of high-conflict cases. The data shows that once a child reaches the stage of total rejection, the success rate for reunification therapy drops below 20%. The breach, once fully formed, becomes a permanent feature of the social landscape. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, we have to look at the ultimate consequence of this total systemic failure. We have mapped the destruction of the mind, the money, the body, the reputation, and the bond. But what happens when a man reaches the absolute bottom? What is the path back if one exists? Or does the system simply move on to the next case? In Part 9, we are going to look at the final decree and the aftermath. We will examine the data on post-divorce traumatic stress disorder in men and the sociological reality of the permanent respondent status. We will look at the case studies of men who have attempted to rebuild from zero in 2026 and the specific obstacles the U.S. social structure places in their way. You have seen the anatomy of the collapse. Now we look at the wreckage that remains when the dust of the courtroom finally settles. Is there life after the machine is done with you? Or are you forever defined by the papers that ended your first life? The answer lies in the data of the second act. And for many, it is a journey into a completely different kind of American reality. The journey into a completely different kind of American reality begins the moment the judge's gavel falls for the final time. In 2026, the final decree is often portrayed in popular media as a moment of liberation, but the social science data regarding the American male suggests a much more complex and often darker transition. For David, our project manager, the signing of the papers marks the beginning of the second act, a period characterized by the clinical phenomenon known as the permanent respondent status. In the United States, once a man is processed through the family court system, he does not simply return to being a single man. He becomes a ward of the state's administrative oversight, where his income, his residence, and his behavior remain under a perpetual microscope. To understand the weight of this aftermath, we must first analyze post-divorce traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. While not yet a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5, social scientists and trauma specialists in 2026 use this term to describe a specific cluster of symptoms found in men who have navigated high-conflict domestic litigation. Unlike standard PTSD, which often results from a discrete, past event, PTSD is a state of ongoing active trauma. For David, the trauma is not over because the case is closed. Every time a notification pings on his phone, he experiences a physiological startle response. Is it a new motion? Is it a message from his ex-spouse that will require a legal response? This constant state of hypervigilance keeps the cortisol levels we discussed in Part 6 at a baseline that is twice the national average for married men. The potential outcome of this sustained stress is a breakdown of the executive function, making the simple task of rebuilding a life feel like navigating an obstacle course in the dark. Imagine David attempting to secure a new lease in 2026. The U.S. housing market has evolved into a system that prioritizes algorithmic stability. When David applies for a mid-tier apartment, the AI-driven tenant screening tools look beyond his salary. They see the high debt-to-income ratio created by his child support and alimony obligations. In the eyes of a cold algorithm, David is a high-risk liability. He is paying out 40% of his gross income before he even buys a gallon of milk. Case studies show that divorced men in 2026 are frequently forced into substandard housing or co-living situations well into their 40s and 50s, not because they don't work hard, but because their financial history is permanently anchored to a dissolved household. This is the structural reality of the second act. You are running a race while carrying the weight of a ghost. Let's look at the step-by-step erosion of social capital during this period. In the American social structure, a man's identity is often tied to his role as a provider within a specific community. When David loses that role, he enters a state of social anomie. He is no longer the guy at the neighborhood barbecue. He is the guy living in a one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town who only appears on weekends. Historical trends indicate that this loss of status leads to a phenomenon called the withdrawal reflex. To avoid the perceived pity or judgment of his former social circle, David stops attending events. He stops calling old friends. He retreats into a digital world where the only people who understand him are other men in the same situation. While this provides temporary validation, it often leads to a feedback loop of resentment and isolation that prevents him from forming the new, healthy bonds necessary for a successful recovery. Furthermore, we must address the professional stagnation trap. In 2026, corporate America has become increasingly focused on the holistic wellness of its employees. On the surface, this sounds supportive, but for a divorced man, it can be a double-edged sword. If David's productivity has dipped during the 2-year legal battle, he is often flagged as low resilience by talent management software. When a promotion opportunity arises, the decision-makers might look at David and see a man who is distracted by personal issues, whereas a married peer is seen as stable and committed. This is the invisible ceiling of the divorced male. The financial requirement to earn more has never been higher, yet the professional path to doing so has been subtly obstructed by the sociological stigma of his marital failure. Consider the reality of the repartnering market. In 2026, dating apps and social platforms have integrated background checks and vetting cultures. When David attempts to start a new relationship, he is faced with the baggage audit. A potential partner in the US today is conditioned to look at a divorced man not as a person, but as a set of liabilities. Does he have a good relationship with his kids? Is his ex-spouse high conflict? How much of his paycheck is spoken for? If David is honest about his situation, his geographic dislocation, his financial ledger, and his legal history, he is often filtered out by the algorithms. If he is not honest, the relationship is built on a foundation of omission. This creates a secondary layer of stress where the man feels he must perform a version of stability that he has not yet achieved, leading to what sociologists call the authenticity gap. The concept of the permanent respondent also manifests in the administrative burden of the state. In many U.S. jurisdictions in 2026, a man must report any change in income, any change in residence, and sometimes even any change in his household composition to the court or the state's enforcement agency. If David gets a 5% raise, the system is designed to immediately capture a portion of that for increased support. This creates a psychological disincentive to excel. Why work the extra overtime hours if 60% of the additional net income is automatically diverted? This leads to a state of career flatlining, where men choose the path of least resistance rather than the path of maximum potential, further cementing their downward economic mobility. We also have to look at the fatherhood absence paradox. Even if David has secured a fair custody arrangement, he often finds that the quality of the time is strained by the shadow of the litigation. He is afraid to be the disciplinarian, because he doesn't want to give his children any reason to complain to the other parent, which could lead to a new round of mediation. He becomes the permissive parent, which undermines his own authority and the children's long-term development. This is the sociological hollowing out of the father figure. He is present in body, but his role has been so restricted by legal and social fears that he cannot provide the full spectrum of parenting that he once did. The data on the second act suggests that the most successful men are those who engage in radical identity reconstruction. They don't try to get their old life back. They build a completely new one on a different set of values. But the obstacles are significant. In the U.S. social sciences, we see that the lack of rites of passage for divorced men leaves them in a state of perpetual adolescence. There is no social ritual to mark the end of the grieving and the beginning of the new life. They are simply expected to move on, while the system continues to pull at their resources. As we reach the end of this deep dive into the aftermath, we have to ask, is this the end of the story? Is the American man destined to be a permanent respondent to a life he no longer lives? Or is there a way to fundamentally change the social contract to prevent this total systemic collapse? In the final part of this masterclass, Part 10, we are going to look at the path forward and the future of the American social contract. We will examine the emerging historical trends of collaborative divorce, the rise of fatherhood advocacy, and the data-driven proposals for legal reform that aim to balance the scales. We will explore how the next generation of men is responding to these sociological realities and what the marriage of 2030 might look like. The machine has been dismantled. Now we look at how to build something that actually works for everyone. The final chapter is about the evolution of the American family and the survival of the male identity. The evolution of the American social contract is not a distant theory. It is a live, unfolding response to the systemic failures we have meticulously documented throughout this masterclass. In 2026, we are beginning to see the first tangible signs of a sociological correction. The wreckage that men like David have endured is serving as the catalyst for a new era of marital and legal pragmatism. To understand the path forward, we must look at the emerging historical trends that are fundamentally reshaping the way men enter, maintain, and, if necessary, exit the domestic union. This is the transition from the era of accidental destruction to the era of intentional protection. Imagine a version of David's story that begins not with a surprise filing, but with a foundational understanding of the legal landscape. In 2026, we are witnessing the rise of premarital sociological counseling. This is not the traditional religious or emotional counseling of the past. Instead, it is a data-driven analysis of the marital contract. Young men entering the workforce and considering marriage are increasingly treating the union as a high-stakes partnership. They are looking at the potential outcomes of the 2026 tax codes, the state-specific custody statutes, and the historical trends of asset division before the wedding day. This is what social scientists call the professionalization of the private sphere. It is a movement away from romantic idealism and toward a model of informed consent. One of the most significant shifts in the path forward is the mainstreaming of collaborative divorce. In the previous parts of this series, we looked at how the adversarial model of the U.S. legal system incentivizes conflict to maximize billable hours. In 2026, a growing number of jurisdictions are implementing mandatory mediation-first protocols. In a collaborative model, David and his spouse would sit down with a team of professionals, including a financial neutral and a child specialist, rather than opposing litigators. The potential outcome here is a reduction in legal fees by up to 60%. But more importantly, the collaborative process shifts the focus from winning to problem solving. It removes the silver bullet of the temporary restraining order and replaces it with a structured, transparent negotiation. Social science data suggests that families who choose the collaborative path report 40% higher rates of successful long-term co-parenting compared to those who go through a contested courtroom battle. Furthermore, we must address the legislative revolution regarding presumptive 50-50 custody. In 2026, the movement that began in states like Kentucky and Florida has gained massive momentum across the United States. This is the sociological shift from the best interests of the child as a subjective judicial guess to the best interests of the child as a documented need for both parents. The data-driven argument is simple: children with active, engaged fathers have better outcomes in every measurable category, from educational attainment to emotional stability. By making 50-50 custody the legal starting point, the system removes the primary weapon of the gatekeeping parent. David would no longer have to prove he is a fit father. His fitness is presumed. This shifts the burden of proof to the party trying to limit access, effectively ending the era of the visitor father and the fatherhood penalty. Let's look at the step-by-step evolution of the alimony reform movement. In 2026, social scientists are advocating for the sunsetting support model. Instead of indefinite alimony that traps a man in the permanent respondent status, newer legislative proposals focus on rehabilitative support. This model is designed to provide the lower-earning spouse with a fixed, short-term window of financial assistance specifically tied to re-entering the workforce or completing an educational program. Once that goal is achieved, the financial obligation ends. For David, this would mean his future labor is no longer a perpetual asset of a dissolved household. This approach aligns the legal system with the reality of the 2026 labor market, where dual income potential is the standard for economic survival. Case studies in 2026 are also highlighting the rise of the lifestyle prenup among the younger generations, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. These individuals have watched the destruction of their fathers and uncles and are entering relationships with a different set of expectations. They are utilizing the concept of sunset clauses in their marriage contracts, which require the terms of the prenup to be renegotiated every 7 to 10 years. This prevents the maintenance blindness we discussed in Part 2. It forces the couple to have regular, honest conversations about the state of their partnership and the equity of their contributions. From a sociological perspective, this is the application of the Agile management model to the family unit. It acknowledges that people change, careers evolve, and the social contract must be updated to remain fair. The path forward also involves a fundamental reconstruction of the male social network. We are seeing the rise of fatherhood advocacy groups that function as more than just support circles. They are becoming legal and social cooperatives. In 2026, men are utilizing technology to create decentralized networks of shared information. David can now access peer-reviewed data on specific judges, evaluators, and attorneys before he ever spends a dollar on a retainer. This is the democratization of legal intelligence. By pooling their experiences and resources, men are effectively countering the isolation and misinformation that historically led to poor outcomes. This is the sociological concept of collective resilience in action. Consider the marriage of 2030. Social scientists predict that the next decade will see a move toward limited liability partnerships for domestic unions. This involves a clear separation of premarital assets, a defined formula for household contributions, and a pre-agreed-upon exit strategy that prioritizes the stability of the children over the emotional grievances of the adults. It is a more clinical, perhaps less romantic view of marriage, but it is one that is designed to survive the high-volatility environment of the 21st century. It is a response to the 2026 data that shows the most stable marriages are those where both parties feel they have a clear understanding of their rights and responsibilities. For David, the final stage of his journey is the reclamation of purpose. We have discussed the health risks, the financial collapse, and the reputation damage. But the data also shows that men who navigate this crisis and reach the other side often develop a level of psychological fortitude that is rare in the general population. This is what researchers call post-traumatic growth. David is no longer defined by his role as a husband or a provider in a specific house. He has rebuilt his life on a foundation of self-reliance and emotional intelligence. He has learned to navigate a system that was designed to break him, and in doing so, he has become a mentor for the next generation. This is the ultimate survival of the male identity. The ability to lose everything and still retain the core of who you are. In conclusion, this masterclass has been a deep dive into the clinical, often harsh reality of the American divorce machine. We have looked at the mind, the money, the body, and the legacy. We have analyzed the system not as we wish it to be, but as the social science data shows it actually is in 2026. The knowledge you have gained here is your primary defense. By understanding the historical trends, the potential outcomes, and the case studies of those who came before you, you are no longer a passive observer of your own life. You are an informed actor in a complex social system. The machine may be vast, and the statistics may be daunting, but the path forward is being paved by those who refuse to be defined by their worst day. The future of the American family depends on our ability to create a system that values the presence of the father as much as the stability of the household. We are moving toward a world where the social contract is built on transparency, equity, and the recognition of our shared humanity. This is the end of the masterclass, but for many of you, it is the beginning of a new, more resilient chapter. Keep the data close, keep your network strong, and remember that the most powerful thing you can possess in this system is the truth.